Welcome to CSS Breakdown, Book by Book Season 2, where we're unpacking Roger Hopkins Burke's An Introduction to Criminological Theory. In Episode 13, we explore how biology and society intertwine to shape criminal behavior in the chapter on socio-biological theories of crime and deviance.
That's right. And it's a really interesting shift because, we spent some time back in Chapter 5 talking about those theories that were purely biological.
Right, the predestined actor model stuff.
Exactly. The ones that really honed in on measurable things, bodies, brains, genetics, looking for the sole cause there.
Yeah, and those early theories, well, they were influential, no doubt, but the book makes it pretty clear their power to actually explain crime is, well, limited.
Definitely. Because when you dig deeper, sure, some studies might show a link here or there, but consistently you find social factors, environmental things, they're just as important, maybe even more so.
The chapter actually says purely biological explanations only seem to fit a tiny minority of offenders, which isn't much.
Not at all. And that realization was kind of a big deal. It showed that just looking at biology was missing huge parts of the picture.
So that led to a change, a rethink.
Yeah, exactly. In recent years, there's been this effort to, as the book puts it, rehabilitate biological explanations. But it's different this time.
How so?
It's not about going back to that old biological determinism. It's about bringing biology back in, yes, but crucially, integrating it with social and environmental factors. It leads to what they call a multi-factor approach.
Okay, so multi-factor, meaning biology isn't the cause, but maybe like it increases the risk or makes someone more vulnerable.
Precisely. That's the core idea. Certain biological factors might make someone more predisposed, more susceptible to criminal behavior. But, and this is key, they aren't absolute determinants.
Right. It's not like gene for crime.
Not at all. Criminal behavior, from this viewpoint, isn't just an automatic outcome of having a certain biological trait. It emerges when those biological factors interact with psychological stuff or social factors. It's that interplay, that combination, that's really the focus.
This feels like the bridge we needed, connecting the dots between the social theories and the biological ones. And this brings us to the main topic for this deep dive, right? Biosocial theory and biosociology.
Spot on. It's presented as this emerging paradigm, a way of thinking that actively tries to integrate findings from the natural sciences, biology, genetics, neuroscience, even evolutionary psychology, into the more traditional sociological ways of understanding human behavior, especially crime and deviance.
But it's not just slapping a bio label on sociology, it's a deeper integration.
Absolutely. The source is really emphatic about this. This is not just pure biology repackaged. The name itself, biosocial, tells you that. The core principle is recognizing what Lancaster and colleagues called the continuous, mutual, and inseparable interaction between biology and the social environment.
Inseparable interaction. I like that. It really drives home that you can't just pull them apart.
Exactly. They're constantly shaping each other within us. And biosociology is also careful about what it doesn't claim to do.
Okay, like what?
Well, it doesn't pretend to have found the single ultimate cause for something as complex as crime. And it doesn't try to, reduce everything down to just biology. That was a fair criticism of some older theories, that they were too reductionist.
Right, avoiding that oversimplification. So if it's not doing that, what is its main insistence? What's the non-negotiable part?
It insists that biological processes have to be part of the conversation. They need to be recognized and included in any proper analysis of behavior. And maybe even more importantly, the analysis has to be consistent with what we actually know about biology.
So you can't have a theory of crime that just completely ignores or contradicts basic biology.
Pretty much. It's about building a more complete, scientifically grounded picture, acknowledging that all our social and psychological stuff happens on a biological foundation.
It really shifts from that old nature versus nurture debate, doesn't it? It's more like nature through nurture, or nature and nurture constantly interacting.
That's a great way to put it. And the chapter walks us through some key thinkers and examples to show how this actually works in criminology.
Perfect. Let's get into those. Where do we start seeing this biosocial approach in action?
Well, a really foundational figure the source points to is Sarnoff, Mednick, and his colleagues. Their work goes back to the late 70s and into the 80s.
Mednick. Okay, how did his work fit this biosocial mold?
Mednick was clear. Biology is only part of the story. He stressed that the physical environment, the social setting, they're deeply involved too. And he and his colleagues, Moffat and Stack, made this really interesting point about when biological factors seem most predictive.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
They basically argued that biological factors are kind of more useful for predicting antisocial behavior when someone's social background is actually pretty good, not particularly criminogenic.
Huh. Why is that?
Well, think about it. If someone grows up in a really supportive, stable home, good socialization, all that, but still shows major antisocial behavior, then maybe those underlying biological factors stand out more as a potential reason.
Right, because the environment isn't obviously pushing them that way.
Exactly. But if someone comes from what they called criminogenic social conditions, lots of poverty, instability, crime in the neighborhood, then the environment itself is such a powerful force that isolating a specific biological contribution becomes much harder. The social factors might just overshadow it.
That makes sense. The environment can sort of amplify or maybe even mask the biological influence.
Precisely. It highlights that interaction again. Mednick also developed a specific biosocial theory about learning self-control.
Learning control, how does that work?
His starting point was that, look, we all have urges sometimes that society doesn't like. Antisocial impulses, maybe criminal ones. We have to learn to control them.
Okay, so it's about learning impulse control. Where does the biology come in?
He argued this learning happens mostly in families with cures, and it's based on being punished for doing the wrong thing. But the biological part is how our body reacts to that punishment. He linked it to the autonomic nervous system, the ANS.
The ANS, right? Fight or flight, heart rate, sweating, all that automatic stuff.
That's the one. So Mednick proposed, when you get punished, say, a kid gets told off, your ANS kicks in, you feel that anxiety or discomfort. Now, if your ANS reaction is short, if that bad feeling goes away quickly once the punishment stops, that quick relief acts like a reward.
A reward for stopping the bad behavior.
Kind of. The rapid end to the discomfort reinforces avoiding that behavior. It helps you learn, okay, don't do that again. It speeds up the conditioning process.
Makes sense. So what if the reaction is slow?
Well, that's the flip side. Mednick suggested if your physiological recovery is slow, that uncomfortable feeling hangs around. It doesn't provide that quick reinforcing relief. So the punishment is less effective at teaching you to avoid the behavior next time.
And his big idea was?
His ultimate proposal was that criminals, especially those who keep offending, often tend to be people with these slow autonomic nervous system responses to stimuli like punishment, a specific biological difference affecting how they learn from social consequences.
Wow, okay. A potential physiological reason why some people might struggle more with social learning and control. That's a clear biosocial link. Who else was important in this area?
Another key figure the chapter mentions is Jeffrey, writing around 1977. Jeffrey was really forceful about needing to bring biology into criminology.
Was he worried about being linked to the old problematic biological theories?
Very much so. He strongly argued that this new biological criminology was not neo-Lombrosian. He wanted to make that break clear. And he was pretty critical of theories that just ignored biology altogether. He saw them as incomplete.
So what was his alternative? How did he suggest putting it all together?
Jeffrey pushed for a systems model. His view was that biological factors, psychological ones, sociological ones, they don't just exist separately. They're all interacting constantly in this complex system. And it's that whole system that produces behavior, including crime.
A systems model.
Yeah.
Sounds like feedback loops, lots of moving parts, not just A causes B.
Exactly. And central to Jeffrey's thinking was this idea that we're born with certain biological and psychological characteristics, the nature part that might predispose us, or maybe even cause certain behaviors somewhat separate from just our upbringing or nurture.
So inherent differences matter.
Yes, but, and this is crucial for the biosocial perspective, he immediately connects it back to interaction. He stressed there's huge interaction between our nature and our nurture, happening through the physical environment and even through feedback loops in our own body chemistry. Our biology affects how we experience the environment, and the environment can actually change our biology.
Can you give an example of that interaction from Jeffrey? The book mentions one, right?
Yeah, he used the example of poverty. Now, poverty is obviously a social economic thing, right? An environmental condition.
Sure.
But Jeffrey pointed out the physical side. People in poverty often have poorer diets, miss out on key nutrients. They might also be exposed to more pollution, more environmental toxins where they live and work.
Okay, so that's the environmental input. How does that become biological.
Jeffrey's argument was that these things, the poor diet, the toxins, get into the body. Your biochemical system processes them, and they can end up affecting neurochemicals in your brain. Those neurochemicals influence mood, function, behavior. So poverty, a social issue, can lead to behavioral differences through this pathway. Environment impacts diet exposure, which impacts body chemistry, which impacts brain function, which influences behavior.
That really connects the dots in a concrete way.
Yeah.
It's not just the stress of poverty. It could be the actual physical consequences changing your biology.
It's a powerful example of that biosocial interaction. And the source notes this line of thinking about diet, environment, neurochemistry got picked up by some right realist thinkers, sometimes in ways the book calls highly contentious.
Ah, okay. The connection to the new right. That seems like a good place to transition.
Definitely.
All right, let's dig into that connection between biosocial theory and the new right. You mentioned James Q. Wilson, a big name in right realism from earlier chapters.
Yeah, Wilson was central to that shift back towards rational choice and individual responsibility. But his work with Richard Herrnstein, especially their 1985 book, went further. It tried to provide a more definitive account, integrating biological and social factors explicitly. It wasn't just about rationality anymore.
So they were attempting their own kind of biosocial synthesis. But from that right realist angle, what were the main components of their explanation for crime?
They laid out three main elements. First up were constitutional factors.
Constitutional.
Factors they saw as having some biological origin. But they were careful, like Mednick and Jeffrey, to say it's not necessarily purely genetic.
What kinds of things did they include?
Well, they start with a basic observation. Crime is overwhelmingly committed by young men. They argue this link between maleness, youth, and crime probably has both constitutional roots, biological status, and social ones, like how young men are treated, socialized. So it's mixed right from the start. They also include things like gender, age, intelligence, which they saw as significantly biological body type, personality traits. These are seen as kind of biological givens that interact with the social world. But importantly, they stress these aren't determiners, they're predispositions.
Okay, so biology provides tendencies, but doesn't dictate outcomes.
Yeah.
That's element one. What's number two?
Element two is learning and environment, and they frame this very much through behavioral psychology, specifically B.F. Skinner's ideas about operant conditioning.
Right, learning through rewards and punishments. Behaviors that get rewarded tend to stick. Those that get punished fade away.
Exactly that. Wilson and Herrnstein argue we learn how to act based on the consequences our past actions have brought. The environment basically teaches us through this system of rewards and punishments. And theoretically, you could change the environment, change the rewards and punishments to shape behavior. They connect crime propensity to how this reinforcement system works on people with different constitutional makeups.
So your basic biology interacts with the consequences you learn to expect from your surroundings.
Precisely. And they place things like family influence, schools, the community within this learning framework. These are the places where we learn those crucial lessons about consequences.
Got it. Constitutional factors. Learning via reinforcement was the third piece.
The third element is the conscience. They actually support Eysenk's idea that conscience is a conditioned reflex.
A conditioned reflex, like an automatic learned internal stop sign.
Sort of, yeah. A learned inhibition that becomes almost automatic. But they argue its effectiveness varies a lot between people. They describe a spectrum.
A spectrum of conscience strength.
Right. Some people, they say, internalize rules so strongly in childhood. Breaking the law just isn't really an option. They consider their internal reflexes super strong. For others, it's more situational. Breaking the law depends on the perceived risks and rewards right then, suggesting maybe a weaker or less consistently conditioned conscience. And then there are those who, they suggest, seem to struggle to appreciate consequences at all, making them prone to crime in almost any situation.
And this variation in conscience strength, how does it link back to the other two elements?
They argue it depends on both the person's constitution, those inherent predispositions, and the learning environment they experienced, particularly how consistent and effective the rewards and punishments were for shaping their behavior early on.
So it all ties together. Biology influences learning, which shapes the conscience, and that interplay explains crime risk.
That's their framework, yes. Constitutional factors, reinforcement history, and conscience strength interacting.
And did they use this to explain bigger crime trends in society?
They did. They argued this interaction could explain why crime rates might go up or down, sometimes even in confusing ways, like rising during both good economic times and bad times, because the balance of these individual and social factors is complex.
So not just down to the economy then. What did they see as the main drivers of long-term trends?
They pointed to three big things. First, shifts in the age structure. More young males equals more crime risk due to what they saw as inherent temperament and shorter time horizons in that group.
Connects straight back to constitutional factors.
It does. Second, changes in the perceived benefits versus costs of crime. This is more aligned with the rational choice idea. If crime seems easier, more profitable, or less likely to be punished, more people will do it, especially property crime.
So the environmental reinforcement changes.
Right. And their third factor was broader. Changes in society's overall investment in teaching internalized self-control.
Society's investment, what does that mean?
They're talking about how effectively institutions like families, schools, churches, even the media are doing their job of instilling values like delaying gratification, accepting rules, controlling impulses. If society, in their view, puts less emphasis on building this internal self-control, you'll see more crime because fewer people develop that strong inner conscience or brake mechanism.
Okay, so it's a mix. Demographics, rational calculations based on the immediate environment, and these broader cultural shifts in promoting self-discipline. It's definitely a multi-layered view from that right realist perspective.
It is. It tries to weave individual and social threads together. Now, the source mentioned these biosocial ideas can lead to some pretty contentious stuff. Where does it get most controversial?
Yes. Arguably, the most heated area, the one that sparks the most debate, is when these theories try to explain rape through an evolutionary lens.
Okay, yeah, this is definitely sensitive ground. We need to be careful to just report what the source says about these theories and the criticisms.
Absolutely. The source explains these theories, look at possible evolutionary psychological adaptations as contributing factors to rape, drawing parallels sometimes from animal behavior. And this is instantly controversial because, as the source stresses, traditional sociology sees rape entirely differently.
Right, not as any kind of adaptation, but as violence, power, rooted in social structures, patriarchy, pathology, completely different framework.
And the objections listed are huge, ethical, religious, feminist, political, scientific. It's a minefield.
It really is. So evolutionary psychology generally works on the idea that our minds and behaviors are shaped by evolution, by what helped our ancestors survive and reproduce.
Okay, psychological traits as adaptations.
Right. And within that, some researchers looked at animal behaviors that, well, looked like forced mating. The book mentions ducks, geese, instances of males using violence to force copulation against clear resistance.
But the source makes a critical point here, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The controversy isn't really about observing geese. It's about interpreting that and then applying it to human rape.
Exactly. That's the massive leap. The core socio-biological argument, as the book lays it out, is this. Because rape can sometimes lead to pregnancy, maybe, just maybe, it offered a reproductive advantage to ancestral males who did it. And if it did, then psychological traits predisposing males to coercive sex might have been selected for by evolution.
So the argument is a predisposition to rape might have evolved because it could, in theory, lead to more offspring.
That's the controversial hypothesis presented. Thornhill and Palmer are the names most associated with popularizing this around the year 2000. Their starting point is that basically all human behaviors must have some evolutionary root.
An assumption that evolution underlies everything.
Pretty much. So applying that to rape, they argue the question isn't if evolution is involved somehow, but whether rape itself is an adaptation favored because it increased descendants. And they argue, yes, it is.
What evidence do they offer for such a claim?
They point to things like the fact that most rape victims are women of childbearing age. They interpret that pattern as suggesting the motivation is tied to reproduction. They also propose that women, in turn, evolved psychological defenses against rape.
Female adaptations to prevent rape.
Yes. And as supporting evidence, they cite a study suggesting that victims of childbearing age suffer more psychological trauma from rape than older women. They interpret this difference in trauma as reflecting the greater genetic cost for younger women whose reproductive potential is threatened.
Interpreting trauma through a reproductive fitness lens.
That's their argument as presented. Now, the source is careful to include Thornhill and Palmer's stated intention. They claim they're describing an evolutionary inclination mainly to find better ways to prevent rape, not to excuse rapists.
They argue you need to understand the evolutionary roots as they see them to stop it.
That's their position. They suggest rape can only be tackled effectively if society understands these alleged evolutionary origins. And based on that, they discuss prevention, including things like chemical castration and advocating for much tougher sentences.
Okay, but the source also highlights very strong opposition, especially from other biologists,
Yeah.
right? What are the main critiques?
Yes, huge opposition. The source outlines three key arguments against these theories, citing critics like Travis and Fausto Sterling. First is anthropomorphism.
Reading human qualities into animals.
Exactly. Critics say applying the human concept of rape, which legally hinges on informed consent, a complex human idea to animal behavior, is fundamentally flawed. You're projecting human intentions and legal frameworks onto animals.
So we might be misinterpreting what we're even seeing in animals.
That's the argument. The second critique hits the core evolutionary claim. Is forced sex actually an effective reproductive strategy? Critics say, often, no. The source notes observations where forced mating attempts in animals are ineffective. Males might injure or kill the female, fight other males instead, or groups of males might attack and kill a female. That doesn't look like a reliable way to pass on genes that evolution would strongly favor.
Right, the supposed evolutionary benefit doesn't seem very reliable. What's the third critique?
The third comes from those who might not deny that controlling female sexuality exists, maybe even in humans historically, but they argue forcefully that human rape is primarily culturally conditioned. It's about power, social structures, learned behavior, not some direct evolutionary mandate.
So even if there are biological echoes, human rape is overwhelmingly shaped by culture, power dynamics, patriarchy, social learning, things specific to human societies, not just raw evolution.
Precisely. They argue focusing on an evolutionary adaptation distracts from the real social causes of this violence and is scientifically weak anyway. It's clearly a deeply divisive application of sociobiology.
It really underscores the difficulties when applying biological ideas to such complex, socially embedded human behaviors. Let's shift gears to another area the source covers. Sociobiological explanations for childhood delinquency, especially early onset persistent offending.
Right. There's been a lot of research interest here, especially in the US and parts of Europe, looking at kids who show antisocial behavior really young and just keep going into adulthood.
What's driving that focus? Why the interest in that specific group?
A big reason is the evidence suggesting a small group of offenders commits a huge amount of crime. The source mentions figures like 5–6% of offenders being responsible for maybe 50% of known crimes.
Wow, that's a massive concentration, the chronic 6% idea.
Exactly. So understanding that group is crucial for crime prevention, and this group is often seen as really hard to rehabilitate, the most likely to become lifelong offenders, recidivists.
So the goal is to find early risk factors for that specific pattern, early onset, persistent trouble, hoping that leads to better earlier interventions.
That's the idea. Find the early warning signs to target help more effectively. And Adrian Raine is a key name here. Around 2002, he proposed a biosocial model, specifically looking at how both biological risks and environmental risks contribute to this pattern.
Another model focusing on that bio-environment interaction, but zeroed in on childhood issues.
Yes. And the source highlights research testing this model by looking at the interaction between perinatal complications and environmental adversity.
Perinatal, that's around birth, right?
Yeah, the source defines it clearly. Prenatal is conception to the 7th month of pregnancy. Perinatal is the 7th month through the 1st month after birth. Problems during these times, birth complications, mother's health issues can affect the baby's central nervous system development.
And what did studies find when they looked at those complications alongside tough environments?
A really consistent interaction effect. It seems having both significant perinatal problems and growing up in a really adverse environment is strongly linked to developing serious, persistent antisocial behavior later on. Several studies back this up.
So it's the combination again, not necessarily the birth complication on its own or the bad environment on its own, but the two together creating a much higher risk.
That's the pattern the research shows. Studies just looking at perinatal complications alone often don't find a strong direct link to crime. But when those complications happen in the context of family adversity, poverty, instability, that's when the risk really seems to jump.
Can you give an example from the studies mentioned?
Sure. Raine, Brennan, and Mednick's Danish study is a classic. They found boys who had both birth complications and experienced early maternal rejection in their first year were way more likely to become violent offenders as adults compared to boys with only one risk factor, or neither.
A clear biological vulnerability interacting with a specific negative environmental experience.
Right. And another study by Arsenault and colleagues looked at low-income boys. They found perinatal complications involving actual physical harm predicted more physical aggression later, ages 6-17, but again, primarily when the boys were raised in poverty.
The biological risk needed the environmental stressor to really manifest as aggression.
Exactly. It's strong support for that biosocial interaction idea. Biological vulnerability seems to make kids more sensitive to bad environments.
And the source also mentions all the research just on the environment itself, particularly parenting, right?
Oh, absolutely. A huge amount of research links parenting quality, especially early on, to antisocial behavior. Things like parents being unresponsive, rejecting, overly harsh or inconsistent. Those are consistently linked to kids starting antisocial behavior early.
And good parenting is protective.
Definitely. Responsive, sensitive, emotionally available parenting is linked to better outcomes. Kids learn to regulate behavior better. They develop better social skills. Conversely, lack of responsiveness, parental rejection, those are strong predictors of later trouble.
So the early caregiving environment is clearly critical.
Hugely critical. And this environmental research often points towards the cumulative risk hypothesis.
Cumulative risk, meaning the more bad stuff piles up, the worse the outcome.
Basically, yes. The idea is that it's often the total number of stressors a child faces, poverty, parental conflict, poor housing, whatever, rather than any single specific risk that's most predictive of long-term problems.
Like stacking weights on a scale.
Exactly. Classic studies by Rutter showed this really clearly back in the 70s. As the number of family stressors went up, the rate of child adjustment problems shot up dramatically. Sarnoff found something similar. Kids with high scores on multiple environmental risks did much worse than kids with low scores.
Okay, so if we put it all together, we have potential biological vulnerabilities, maybe from the perinatal period. We have the huge impact of the early environment, especially parenting. And we have this idea that environmental risks add up. The overall picture seems to be that biology and environment interact, and multiple environmental hits really amplify the risk for persistent antisocial behavior.
That's the synthesis the source presents. Biological factors might create a vulnerability, but it's the environment, especially a high-risk, high-stress environment, that often determines if that vulnerability turns into serious, lasting problems.
And this leads to a really big question the source raises, connecting it back to the wider debates in criminology, doesn't it?
It does. The question becomes, if these combined biological and environmental factors contribute to crime, whose fault or responsibility is it? Is it primarily down to the individual family, as maybe right realists like Wilson and Herrnstein might emphasize? Or does wider society, the government, bear responsibility for the adverse environmental conditions that fuel the problem?
Right. The source links that first view to the right realists and says the second idea, societal responsibility, connects more to left realism, which comes later in the book. It shows how the science gets filtered through different lenses.
Exactly. The source isn't taking sides there, just showing how the research raises these fundamental questions about blame, responsibility, and where we should target interventions in individuals and families, or broader social conditions, or both.
It highlights the complexity. The science points to interaction, but the policy implications are debated. This has really shown how far thinking has come from simple nature versus nurture.
Absolutely. Historically, you had the bio camp and the sociology camp, often not even talking to each other, very defensive of their turf.
Yeah, like they were in different worlds.
But the trends now, the source emphasizes, is towards recognizing you need theories that look at the interaction. Sociology, psychology, biology, all working together.
An emerging synthesis, as Vold, Bernard, and Snipes called it, and they suggested this is actually good for biological criminology.
Yeah, their point, quoted in the source, is that this synthesis probably helps biological approaches because the extreme, purely biological stuff often sounded deterministic, like biology is destiny, which puts people off, raises ethical alarms.
So by integrating social and psychological factors, the biosocial approach seems less rigid, less scary maybe, and potentially more useful.
That's the idea. The source concludes that for biological explanations to remain relevant, they have to ditch that old predestined actor idea and genuinely embrace insights from psychology and sociology, especially the environmental factors.
It's a call for real integration, looking at people from the inside out and the outside in.
It is. Our biology gives us potentials, vulnerabilities, tendencies, but it's the constant dance with our psychology and our social and physical world that shapes how those potentials play out, including whether we engage in crime.
It's definitely a more nuanced and sophisticated picture,
And it pushes us to think about crime and prevention in more complex ways, too.
which leads us perfectly to our final thought for you, the listener. Given everything we've discussed today, this constant, inseparable interaction between individual biological factors like ANS response, constitutional makeup, perinatal health, and environmental factors like parenting, poverty, social learning, how might our approaches to crime prevention and support need to change? Is focusing just on punishing individuals or just on fixing broad social problems enough? Does that miss the reality of this deep entanglement between biology and environment that the research points to?
It really makes you wonder if we need more tailored approaches, ones that address both the individual biological vulnerabilities and the environmental stressors simultaneously.
Definitely a lot to mull over. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the complex world of biosocial criminology.